Welcome to the Non-Essential Podcast. I'm Steve Gibson.
I'm Ben Matlock.
And we're back. We're
here.
here.
Yeah, we are. Fuck yeah.
We survived. The spiders didn't get me this week. I've had a couple other close encounters. One was one of those. I forget if I was in the kitchen, I think, somewhere. And it's like, yeah, it was kitchen because I was cleaning dishes. And I stepped back to reach for something, and right as I stepped back, one dropped down right in front of me, like it would have dropped basically on my face. And it's like, yep, nope, you're
nope.
It was a tiny one. It wasn't like the grossest spider in the world or anything, but it's like, hey, stay the fuck away from me. Don't try to drop on me.
Sorry, honey, we got to burn the new house down.
House down, yeah.
I got bit on the back of my knee.
Cool.
By one, so.
Are you turning in? Have you started turning into a half spider, half person, like the story?
That's the story.
Well, from last week's creepypasta. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought you were talking about Spider-Man. He didn't become half spider, except in some storylines.
I was saying the ones that I've seen.
But no, it just itches and it's annoying. And I can tell they're trying to target weak points. They're experimenting for sure, but fuck them.
I like to think it was watching you skate. And it's like, that looks hard on the knees. Let's attack there first.
I think that's the problem. They don't think. They're just like, oh, he's asleep. Nah.
Bite. I'm not getting anything out of this transaction, but I'm going to bite anyway. So,
because they're petty.
Anyway, yeah, that was we're coming off a 2-week story there, creepypasta starring spiders.
Yeah.
Just in general, spiders, they're the star. So I've got a topic this week, and it's not spiders.
Good. So, awesome.
I actually put something together.
A couple of shows in, maybe we can get back to a somewhat normal life.
This will be normal for the podcast. It was another one of those that I had to double check to see if we'd covered, and you did a similar one a long time ago, but we have not, unless I missed it, covered this, so this should be brand new. That's always the hope. So, once upon a time in Nova Scotia, there lived a woman named Lila Young. It's Lila or Lila. I'll probably say it differently all through this.
Once Upon a Time in Nova Scotia sounds like a Dolph Lundgren action movie.
That's why I wrote. That's exactly what I was thinking when I wrote that line. I started off actually a different way, and I deleted it so I could put that. Lila's parents were devout Seventh-day Adventists, which, if you're not familiar with what that is, it's just a particular strain of Christianity.
A strain? Is that common terminology when talking about a strain?
No, I think there's actual word for it, but
sect.
I like strain.
Strain of Christianity.
Especially and this may be unfair, at least to current day Seventh-day Adventists, if it's still around, but it's a particularly what's the word, devout, I guess, whatever.
Hardcore, sect. As wrestling fans would describe it. All in.
So, yeah, her parents were very into this religion, and she was too, and that is likely how she would meet her future husband, William Peach Young. So I love that somebody actually named their son, gave him the middle name Peach.
William Georgia Peach Young.
Mm-hmm. Although he was not from Georgia, he was originally from Oregon. William had moved to Nova Scotia to pursue his dream of becoming a medical missionary. Although he was not a doctor, nor was he ordained, so whatever. William and Lila would soon wed, and before long she was pregnant with her first child. They'd go on to have 5 children. It's not important to the story, though. In 1927, they would move to Chicago, where William would become a licensed chiropractor before moving back to Nova Scotia later in the same year. So now he was technically a medical person. Although it sounds like he earned his chiropractor's license. This was 1927, so it was probably a weekend course, one of those.
There's some chiropractic courses now. I suspect
There's
of a
weekend
similar
courses,
time.
right?
That's what makes me nervous about chiropractors. Like, people at work will be like, "Oh, they're great," and I'm like, I don't feel comfortable because I don't know like how much work actually went into like touching my spine. You know?
Well, yeah, it's twofold for me. There's that, like, there's still the, like, I don't want to put the whole profession down because people get a lot of, like, they do a lot of great things for a lot of people with joint and spine and back problems. But to me, it still has that, like, stigma of quackery, which is its origins. But I also don't like being touched by strangers, and it's hard to, like, have a chiropractic adjustment without being touched because that's kind of the whole deal there. Anyway, the Youngs were back in Nova Scotia. They had grand ambitions when they opened their practice, which they named the Life and Health Sanatorium, before renaming it the Ideal Maternity Home and Sanatorium.
Both of these sound like ghost houses.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You know it's going to be a good story when they literally put the word sanatorium right.
Yeah, has there ever been a sanatorium that was, like, nice? And people were like, that ended well.
Not from what I've come across, no. So William took the mantle of superintendent, and while also performing the duties as midwife, Lila took the title of managing director. Now, you may be thinking that a chiropractor's license, and in Lila's case, a marriage to a man with a chiropractor's license, were pretty flimsy qualifications to be running a maternity home and sanatorium, but you'd be correct.
Well, those would be those are two titles. Like, the only title that's worse in the context of sanatorium would be something like Archduke of the Sanatorium.
Sanatorium. So yeah, they did not really, they were not qualified in any way to run this. And if you don't know what I mean by maternity home, especially back in the 1920s, they were giving birth, women would come there to give birth. A lot of women still at that time would do home births, but it was getting to a point where more and more would come to hospitals or maternity homes to do that. So yeah, they were not qualified, but however, this is old-timey times, so things like medical licenses and qualifications didn't really mean much, apparently.
Yeah.
So the Youngs
say you're a doctor and shoot anyone who tells you you're not.
We've had a lot of episodes that literally, that's the whole theme, is just the people saying that they do. Remember the dude, I just thought of him, that decided it was medically sound to implant goat testicles in guys' scrotums?
Yeah.
That was a thing that happened.
I haven't heard an argument against that from one doctor. Not even one doctor has written the show to tell me why that's a bad idea.
It's a bad idea. So anyway, the Youngs put out public advertisements for the Ideal Maternity Home that touted their services as a, and I quote, mother's refuge and department for girls. No publicity infants home attached. Personally, that phrase means very little to me today, other than sounding vaguely suspicious. But for clarity, the demographic that they were specifically targeting back in the 1920s were mostly unwed mothers and other women and couples who had need for discreet maternity care and adoption services. Not that there aren't plenty of nosy, judgmental, generally religious identifying folks today, but back then it was way worse. And though William and Lila were themselves deeply religious, they understood the need for these women to have proper care where they were free from judgment and persecution. And that was definitely their motivation and not some other reason that makes this story more in line with what we tend to cover on the Non-Essential Podcast.
Yeah.
So, of course, no matter how charitable your intentions are, they really just wanted to help these poor women that were being persecuted. Running a medical facility is expensive, and nobody would argue that it's unreasonable to charge for the services that they provided. For instance, a married woman seeking a maternity home where she could have her delivery and recovery period, which was generally about a 2-week stay there, would pay about $75. Just as an aside, we spent 3 days in the hospital when our daughter Lincoln was born. Including the delivery, the cost was about $30,000. So
I could have done that for you for $50.
Yeah, a little bit of inflation between now and 1927 in Canada.
Ben's back alley delivery.
Fortunately, in our case, we had some health coverage, so it didn't set me back quite that much, but it was not cheap. Anyway, so yeah, the typical woman seeking delivery there was $75. Unwed mothers seeking a discreet place to give birth, on the other hand, had to pay upwards of $200 for similar services, plus arrangement of adoption for the child. There was an additional $12 fee for diapers and food for the child, and then a weekly $2 fee to, and I quote, warehouse the child between birth and adoption. So not care for the child, but to warehouse them.
Storage.
Right.
Well, you can take them home with you, or we can give them a bunk here.
Do you guys have layaway? Yes, we do.
We can keep them till they're 15, and they can 15. Mow for you.
Yeah. Well, that's what the other option that they were given was to pay a one-time $300 fee, in addition to the $100 to $200 that they'd pay for the birth and all that, to cover the cost of raising the child for the rest of its natural life. That shows me, again, childcare was super cheap back then, because we're looking for daycare for Lincoln, and it's like twice that per week, and this was $300 for its life. So it sounds to me like, I guess the deal was like, you'd pay one amount if you wanted them to put up the kid for adoption, but if you didn't want the kid to go into adoption, you wanted the kid to stick around in like a orphanage, which I don't know why you would choose that as the better life for your kid. You got to pay more for that. Mm-hmm. Now, if the child was to tragically die for whatever reason, there was a $20 burial charge, which would cover the lavish services, plot, headstone, and casket. Just kidding. They'd charge you $20, and then they'd pay their handyman 50 cents to bury the child in a butter box, which is basically just a milk crate. So the Youngs, that meant the Youngs stood to gain $19.50 right away, rather than, the $20 minus expenses per week to keep the children alive, or $300 had they already collected that. But they would certainly never do anything to endanger the life of a baby, even if that meant to make them more money.
I don't appreciate your cynical, sarcastic tone. These two tried.
Yeah, I mean, they'd have to be monsters to do something like that.
And we have a strict only goodies on a non-essential podcast.
Exactly. We only cover saints here. They make for way more interesting stories. So in the 7 years spanning 1928 to 1935, which were basically the first 7 years of operation, the ideal maternity home reported about 150 total births and 12 total infant deaths. That's a mortality rate that it was like 8.8% or whatever. I forget the number. I didn't write it down. But it's 3 times higher than the average of other maternity wards in the area at the time. So, 12 out of 150, you could kind of look at that and be like, well, for unqualified people, that ain't bad. But it really was, especially for the 12 mothers of those children. And it was also, being 3 times higher than average, it was certainly suspicious. But clearly they weren't just like out there murdering babies to turn a profit. But that's because that would be bad business given the amount of money that they would earn from adoptive parents.
We want reoccurring customers.
Well, on top of the charges that I listed to give, birth and put the kid up for adoption.
Bad baby holders for life.
Holders for life, yes. They gave them a nice little care package on the way home, which included condoms with holes poked in them so that they would be sure to return. But, and in addition to the charges that they would charge the women giving birth, they stood to make anywhere from $800 to $1,000 per child from adoptive parents. Although over the first 5 years that price increased fivefold, they were at one point making up to $5,000 per child from parents looking to adopt. So that meant that these adoptable babies were worth a whole lot more money to the Youngs. In fact, it's estimated that from 1937 to 1947, in 10 years, the Youngs had made an estimated $3.5 million from the adoptions alone, which is pretty good by today's standards. But remember, we're talking about a time when childbirth was only $75. So
childbirth was only $75 and men were men.
Right. So, yeah, they stood to make a lot of money off of adopting babies. Of course, the less marketable babies, say mixed race or minority children or children with deformities, were not profitable.
Jesus fucking Christ.
So these babies were starved to death on a diet of molasses and water so the Youngs could collect the aforementioned warehousing fees and funeral expenses. So yeah, turns out they shockingly are not saints.
Turns out people don't want this model of baby anymore.
I'd like to see the first couple times where they tried to like adopt out, say, a black baby, and the stupid parents, because everybody was racist back then, not just these monsters, but the parents were like, yeah, it's cute. Do you have anything, lighter skinned? Like,
I'm telling you, I know it's not hip now, but I'm telling you, this baby is going to be in. Just give it 20 years. Everybody's going to think you're the hip new thing in town.
So the Youngs didn't simply profit off of murdering children and adopting them out. Turns out the mothers of these children proved to be quite useful. Because when these women couldn't pay for the pricey and often fraudulent services the Youngs were providing, they were offered a chance to work off their debts at the ideal maternity home. So this, of course, meant the Youngs had no shortage of free labor, because they do that same bullshit that a lot of people have done, where it's like, you can work off your profit, but we'll pay you $2 a week. But while you're staying here, we're going to charge you $1.30 a week for room and board and food. So, that kind of thing. They
basically mathematical slavery.
Exactly. Although it did say that the average term of employment for these women working off their debts was 18 months. So they didn't it wasn't lifetime indentureship, but they'd keep them there until they had enough people to, have the turnover. So it may sound like a great business model if you're a psychopath, but it wasn't without its bumps. The Nova Scotia Department of Child Welfare had started to catch on to what the Youngs were doing pretty early on. Unfortunately, the lax medical, social, and welfare laws at the time left them largely powerless to actually do anything about it. And to make matters even more difficult, the Youngs had a lot of wealthy and powerful friends who admired them for their obvious business prowess and, of course, wealth. Because everybody knows if you're wealthy, you're just demonstrably better at being a human than those god-awful poor folk. So
it's a shame that 100 years later, that is still how people feel about.
Yeah, I could name off the top of my head 5 situations that it's the same. You have rabid fanboyism for these Youngs who are murdering babies, although it wasn't public knowledge that they were murdering babies, but you have to be pretty willfully ignorant to ignore what's going on there. Yeah. But they still had rabid fanboys because it's look how successful they are. It's fuck you and fuck them. But unfortunately, that's how their justice system apparently works in Canada, the same way as it works here in the U.S., where if you have wealth, you're just beyond the courts. So for their part, the Department of Child Welfare never gave up the chase, at least. In 1936, which would have been 9 years after they started, 8 or 9 years after they started, the Youngs were charged with negligent manslaughter in the deaths of a young mother and her newborn baby. Sadly, of course, they were acquitted of these charges. Then in 1945, they were finally able to document their first concrete evidence of negligence at the center when inspectors found unsanitary living conditions with patients living in dirty bedding, swarming with flies and maggots and that kind of crap. Same stuff you would picture from a place like this. They said a handful of the infants were as low as 50% of the healthy weight that they should be. So in response, an amendment was finally passed to the Maternity Boarding House Act of 1940, and they finally started requiring these practices to actually be licensed, and William and Lila were not. They did apply for a license, but thankfully it was rejected, and it forced them to shut the place down. So, of course, Lila came back and argued that they were just the focus of unfair harassment from these child welfare people who haven't left them alone since they had started. And she formally appealed the board's decision. While the appeal was going on, they, of course, reopened and continued their practice without a license. About the same time as they were fighting and dealing with all of this, the Youngs became the target of immigration officials who were investigating them for the illegal smuggling of, quote, black market babies into the United States. And that's like one of the greatest like punk band like names ever. Black market babies. They were also charged with 7 separate violations of the aforementioned Maternity Boarding House Act, including being found guilty of operating without a license. So while they like reopened without a license, it was one of those like, well, you can't shut us down. And they're like, well, yeah, actually we can. So the law finally had them. And for these 7 crimes, the Youngs were sentenced to pay a whopping fine of $150. Right.
Fuck, dude.
To which they said, oh, that's fine. We can make up with that with just like 8 or so dead babies. Like,
but you can't use dead baby money. Ah, shit.
Within a year, the immigration investigation would also lead to the couple being found guilty of 4 counts of illegally selling babies to American couples. This time, the Youngs were well and truly screwed. Because while the Nova Scotia laws were still largely powerless to effect any real punishment, violation of international law was a much more serious offense. So serious, at this time, the fine was almost $500.
Going after those exotic dead babies.
Right. So neither of these charges carried any actual jail time, despite the home clearly continuing to operate. It's like, well, you paid your fee for operating without a license, so what more can we ask of you? And that should be, and is, both depressing and infuriating. I, however, am not a monster and have not brought you all this story to tell you that the Youngs escaped both karmic and, legal justice.
I've come and with them on the show. Yeah. Let's bring them out here, boys.
Here. I have had a lot of these topics where, and you had the one, I think it was yours. It was recently a serial killer that we profiled that just like disappeared into the ether. I think that was mine. That was
yours. Yeah. It was the guy who he went in. He basically got lost in the mist of World War I.
Yeah. So yeah, we do have those stories where there's no like nice, comeuppance at the end, but this one has some comeuppance. So
spoiler: this show as a whole will not have a happy ending. Like
no,
ever,
and it probably won't be the comeuppance that we all desire, but it does. It is the best flavor of karma, and that's self-inflicted defeat. So Lila Young was usually,
yeah.
Yeah,
I still prefer when I get to fuck somebody up.
Well, yeah,
who's wrong.
I guess if like a masked crusader had like stolen in the night and just like murdered them in their sleep and then whatever, that'd be better. But no, this is self-inflicted because Lila Young was described by most as a physically imposing and intimidating woman. So like when you picture these 20-ish years that this maternity home has been operating, it is one of those deals that, these mothers that they're victimizing and ultimately the babies and stuff, it's not something that can go on without people being like, hey, wait a minute, that was shady as shit.
Yeah.
But she was also one of these women that if you tried to like do anything about it, you thought she'd just like rip your head off with her bare hands. So most people just were afraid to go up against Lila. But that also meant that she had quite the ego. In 1946, a journalist named Mavis Gallant wrote an article titled "Traitors in Fear. Baby farm rackets still lure girls who are afraid of social agencies," which is too long of a fucking title, Mavis. Like, I applaud what you did here, and I applaud you trying to bring light to this situation, but come up with a better title. Her article ran in the Montreal Standard, and it was a critical look into the Young's whole operation. So basically, it was one of those like
hit pieces.
10 TV news reports.
They had
deals.
Nothing substantial to back it up. It was a hit piece. It was fake news.
That was Lila's claim, and so she took them to court for libel.
I bet.
Which, of course, led to a trial for libel. which not only did Lila not win, but through the parade of witness testimonies, investigations, and other evidence, she only managed to prove in court that all these damning allegations were actually true. The ones that up until then she's been able to like avoid with the actual authorities. So yeah, her insisting that this is libel and you can't talk about me like this directly led to proof finally that all this stuff was going on. They lost all their money and they lost the home. They still didn't fucking go to jail, so that sucks. But they died relatively penniless in the 1960s. He had it wasn't cancer, but something like that, and she died shortly later, just poor and pathetic. So at least we have that. Good. But in the end, the handyman that they were paying 50 cents a baby to bury had admitted that they had paid him to bury at least 100 children. There were also rumors that some were just simply burned in the facility's incinerator, so who knows how many children actually died. And, some of it was... There is a natural mortality rate to childbirth, especially back then. But a lot of it was just negligence and murder. If they weren't murdering them on purpose, they were murdering them through just not taking care of them. Yeah. It was a little of both.
Like sheer apathy and incompetence.
Incompetence is wrong. They knew exactly what they were doing. Apathy and greed, really. Yeah. And just lack of any morals. Like I said, at the end, you kind of set it up. They were like, oh, well.
To be fair, isn't that the best setting to prepare a kid for a hard world?
Yeah, well, for the 3 weeks that they're alive, it's like we taught you the ultimate lesson, and now you don't have to go through this whole process.
Absolutely, don't trust anybody who is incentivized financially,
right,
to keep you alive or dead.
So the building itself, which by the time they were finally lost it all, the building had grown to this big sprawling complex. I didn't write it down about how many rooms that they had, but the building would have been worth a lot of money back then. Somebody bought it with plans to turn it into a relatively high-end resort hotel.
Yeah, let's do it. Fuck it.
If they had done that and it was still around today, they'd be making money hand over fist, because what's better than a haunted dead baby hotel? They would have these paranormal people going, paying out the nose.
Since the pandemic, I've played a fair bit of City Skylines, and that's something that's missing in those city builder games, I think, is I want to take buildings with tragic backstories and try to do something really stupid with them.
Yeah, from the early days when the couple times I tried to play that game, if you're not familiar with it, if you don't play game or whatever, it's a city building game. You have to start from basically scratch and design a city.
Yeah.
So you're constantly balancing infrastructure, utilities, tax money, roads, this and that.
Yeah, basically making sure your city is bringing in more than it's putting out.
Yeah, most gamers, even if you're not a huge gamer, you're familiar with SimCity, and it's basically a more modern take on that.
Yeah.
But in the early days for me, I had lots of problems with sanitary conditions going bad because my sewage system wasn't up to snuff and that kind of stuff. So you imagine that and your hospitals, frankly, because that's something you have to manage. So there's a lot of death in the early days of your city that you could profit from.
So what if just you found out after a couple hours into your game, your insane asylum was run by someone even more crazy, and he was doing fucking lobotomies and torturing people and shit. And then
now it's going to be a microbrewery.
And now I'm going to be well, it would be a good elementary school. Right. I want that option. I want to see what happens.
So that's where they were going with this. Unfortunately, before it was ever built, it caught fire and burned to the ground. My guess is that's the cover story, and it actually got sucked into a paranormal portal to hell, from Poltergeist, the house. It just... Whoop.
I want to believe that whole process takes about 2 seconds. It's just it's like a grill starting where it's and then it's just ashes. It's and that's how you know if you've been a really evil person.
So, not a super satisfying end, but at least they didn't retire in the Bahamas with millions of dollars or anything like that. But I guess as a final aside, in typical historic fashion, when you research the ideal maternity home and or the butterbox babies, which is really what this story is known better by, it's the term they gave to all these tragic victims, the babies that were just thrown into boxes and buried in a random field. When you do any kind of like Googling or research for this story, almost all the results come back for Lila Young. She's considered the serial killer and, of course, a huge piece of crap.
Yeah.
But there's clearly a lot of sexism at play here, because even if she was the one like physically responsible for the neglect and murder of these kids, her husband is no less guilty. But he doesn't seem to be.
I am just the superintendent here. What she got up to on the ground level, she was in charge of. I take no responsibility.
So I did want to like kind of point out that kind of, not to like, it's a weird situation to be in and be like, that's bullshit, it's sexism, but she was a monster and you should all hate her. Yeah. Just also hate her husband.
Yeah, just make sure that you realize they were a power couple as far as being pieces of shit. Yeah. I think the jury's still out on him, frankly.
I guess technically he could have been one of those, like, he did have good intentions, and the way she was described, maybe he was just like the little wimp husband.
That would be so fucking funny. Dear. Like, after years, just like a completely oblivious, he would still be guilty, but if he was just like, wait, she did what now? Excuse me.
Towards the end, I did read that he had a pretty heavy alcohol problem. I mean, it could have been one of those. It could have been one of those almost like not reverse, but like domestic things where like he was literally afraid of her and he was along for the like.
He was the original butterbox baby.
Yeah, but no, I think it's kind of crap that it 100% gets pinned on her, but she doesn't. Not that she deserves less ire. He just deserves more, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's kind of like that thing of like, like take the Holocaust. Like Hitler is ultimately the top guy to blame for all that shit. But you have a special contempt when you hear stories about concentration camps and stuff for the people who were like there and running it day to day, because they were just truly fucking sick, evil people. And fair, at least most of them, they just don't get attention because sadly there were so many of them. It's hard to like in school be like, okay, we're gonna like quiz you as much on. Fuck, I can't even say. I can't think of one thing. I know a few, but at least history, they did execute those people and persecuted them and pursued them and wrote them poorly. I mean, they didn't get glossed over in the history books, at least. But it's just they don't have the. Yeah. Anytime we talk about people today that are bad and certain example comes to mind that I won't name, but people use it left and right. Everybody's Hitler when they're bad. If you don't like somebody, they're just Hitler. Some of those comparisons are more apt than others, but we don't remember some of the other horrible people. And frankly, some of them were, like you said, I think more sick and twisted than Hitler. It's like Hitler was just a genocidal maniac. But the things that they did were like genocidal plus like how cruel can you? Well, I mean, like genocide is obviously, it's incredibly evil, and if you find yourself in a political belief that supports it in any context, you're probably on the wrong side of something. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that.
Be as bold to delete the probably from that statement.
Well, I don't want to deal in absolutes. Everything's a gray area in 2020 politics. But like, with somebody like Hitler, it's a matter of like his evilness was in... It was expressed in like political policy and stuff.
Yeah, and just general disregard for certain humans. Like,
and when you're an evil piece of shit, it's very easy to like flagrantly put out like these sort of these initiatives, like, and to be willing to say and sign into law like, hey, we're going to do all this shit that's going to massacre entire segments of people.
Well, that's part of it. You're looking at people as a commodity, and that's exactly what Lila Young did here. People, these babies, and even the women because there was a lot of women that died in childbirth from the negligence.
Yeah.
They didn't care. They weren't heartbroken that they lost a human, because to them they were just a means to an end, and that end was getting rich and being
and it's not to say that like Hitler would be on the ground level and be like appalled and be like, what have I done? He was on the ground level. He saw what they were doing and he was like, good job. So he's a fucking monster. But there is, it is a true partnership of like, you get somebody who's a big picture piece of shit like that, and then you have people on the ground level running it who
it's like the semantic difference between the evil person saying, let's kill this guy, and the guy he's telling to do the murder is like, yeah, but what if we do it by pulling their intestines out while they're still alive and making them eat it? It's like, they're both clearly extremely wrong, but there is that differentiation. One is more evil than the other.
Well, and I don't even know about that, because, if it goes back to the other guy ultimate, and he's like, yeah, that's fine, then it's like, true. Then, you're just as evil. But it's just that thing of like, there is something to be said about somebody who believes suffering is the way forward, and somebody who does, like, in a lot of ways, like, doesn't even care if it's the way forward. You just relish in it,
Yeah. And that's what a lot of those people were. And I don't know that the Youngs relished in murdering babies, but like you said too, once you're murdering babies willingly, you've reached like max level monster. There's no... Yeah,
once you've turned it into, like you said, once you've turned human life into a commodity, then you've crossed that line, and then everything else is just like, where are you on topics. That spectrum?
Right. Yeah. But as kind of a final aside, and it's neat in a kind of tragic and macabre sort of way, but although like this all went down nearly 100 years ago, or at least it opened nearly 100 years ago, this is recent enough that some of the babies themselves who were farmed out from the home are still alive. So like over the decades since this all had come to life and the Youngs like had their downfall and the home got shut down, there's this whole kind of society out there, these people that had been adopted and have just throughout the decades, some of them sooner than others, have realized that, hey, I was born at the ideal maternity home and sold off. And like, so there's almost this like fraternity of survivor babies that had gone through this home. And so to me, that's kind of neat when a lot of the topics that we cover get that kind of fog, that distancing where it's like, oh, these things that people were doing were horrible back then. And it's like, oh, this is still recent enough that some people involved are alive. The Youngs are not. Yeah. The mothers would not be, but some of the babies themselves are. Although we're getting to that point where that's getting fewer and fewer by the decade as well. But that's what I have, the Butterbox babies. This is one that my wife had come across somewhere, and she's like, this will be a good podcast topic. And I agreed. So we got it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's right. Like you said, it's right up our alley. So good job, guys, on your fucking horrible baby fucking business. You made it. You made it onto the non-essential pod. Congratulations.
Well, yeah, we should visit the Young's graves and like leave a little reward for them. Congratulations, you were interesting enough for our podcast.
Yeah, congratulations. You were on episode 105, our 105th winner.
Which feels very gross, congratulating somebody for murdering babies so that they're interesting enough to talk about.
Well, it'd be really confusing as they would be there winning awards with like the woman who was really nice but accidentally pantsed Mr. Rogers. And it's like, why are they in the same category of award?
Yeah, we were. My whole premise of the first half of my like notes today was that we don't talk about good things, but as doing it tongue in cheek, like this was going to be good. But we have covered a few. There was like one-eyed pirate sniper that Canada had in World War II, and that one's kind of more of a mix. Like he wasn't a bad guy. It's still about somebody murdering people, but it was war, and at least he was on the
it was a great action movie.
Yeah,
kind of guy.
And we've covered some others that weren't necessarily bad. And we've covered a lot of people that were just hapless idiots.
Yeah.
But
usually we try to... We talk about what we know, which is bad people and stupid people.
there's a lot of overlap in those too.
But sometimes we come up for air. But yeah, that was fun. But we're done with that now. That's in the past. We must move forward to another week, and next week we will have another show. Stay brave out there, folks.
Goodbye.